in the backdrop of all this drama in Vietnam were the relations themselves with China and the Soviet Union. Okay, we're fighting a de facto war against them by proxy. Okay, their client state, North Vietnam, was trying to infiltrate and unify the country, and the Soviets and the Chinese were paying them with military aid, weapons, and advising. Otherwise, though, after the Chinese Revolution in the late 1940s, the ouster of the Chiang Kai shek regime, and the replacement with Chairman Mao, for the better part of 20 years or so, the United States and China didn't have formal relations. Now remember, Chinese Red Communist forces fought against the United States and UN forces in the Korean conflict in the early 1950s. That was pretty much the only relations that the United States had with China in a war trying to kill each other. Okay? Richard Nixon began a process of reformalizing things, and he did so for various different reasons. You see, both the Soviet Union and China were communist countries. But just because both of them were communist didn't mean that they were rivals amongst each other. The Soviet Union and China were very leery of each other. They had different visions. They had similar, from a conceptual standpoint, they had some very similar ideas, but the way they would go about things and then nationalism and self-protectionism would make them perhaps clash in other ideological ways. The United States wanted to exploit this. So, the United States, under Richard Nixon, would eventually send his trusted advisor, Henry Kissinger, in the early 1970s to Beijing to make various different diplomatic calls, if you will. Shortly upon return, Richard Nixon decides, I myself am going to go to China. And in early 1972, he does just that. Richard Nixon takes an official diplomatic visit to China, and he meets with Chinese authorities. In doing so, he's announcing that the United States is going to begin formal recognition and diplomatic relations with China. He does so for two reasons. One, China is an emerging economic power. Even though they are a communist country which is ideologically opposed to our democracy, they're growing nonetheless. It is better for the world when you have superpowers who, even though they're on opposite sides of ideological conflict, if you will, they are in the very least stable. And when you have stable rivalries, stable maintains keyword. Okay? The United States wanted to stabilize relations with China. They also wanted to do so to send a message to the Soviets. Hey, we're not afraid to talk to communists. We're talking to your communist rival, China. So it's sending a message to the Soviets that, ooh, the Americans are making a power play. They mean business. Okay. So in 1972, various different initiatives are taken after the Nixon visit to China to improve formal relations and begin more economic discussions and trade, perhaps. Okay. In doing so, it has the inevitable effect of improving relations with the Soviet Union because oh boy, you just tried to befriend our arch rival in our ideological view. Okay, we're going to do some things that would help favor diplomacy over militarism as well. And so you begin to have strategic arms limitations treaties, SALT 1 and 2, basically, that limit the number of nuclear arms. Okay, that's good. Okay, so you're going to freeze various different arsenals of your nuclear armament. Okay, both countries will promise to do so. So, by reaching out to China, inevitably you helped establish relations there, but you also brought the Soviet Union to some sort of negotiations. In this case, you're freezing the number of nuclear missiles that are going to be deployed across the world. That's not bad. Okay. Otherwise, though, Vietnam itself, the United States had spent the better part of 15 years or so sending advisors and eventually sending major escalated forces over there as well. Vietnam is what is known as a third world country, or at least it was. That term third world was coined in the 1950s, meaning countries that aren't escalated and haven't adopted perhaps Western or other ideals. They're not an economic superpower. So, while the United States and the Soviet Union and China and Western Europe and Japan were major economic players, they didn't necessarily want to go to war with each other. We've been down that road before, and that's just awful. Okay? So that means if there was going to be ideological conflict, if there were going to be wars, they're largely going to be fought in third world countries, like Vietnam, like perhaps in Central America. Yeah, that's going to be a bit of a problem. So what Richard Nixon wanted to do is establish the idea that the United States wasn't going to basically do what they did in Vietnam. They're not going to take over fighting so as to protect democratic ideals. Under the Nixon Doctrine, the United States promised to defend and develop allies in the third world. They're just not going to take up arms, okay, in major escalations like they did in Vietnam. And in essence, that was basically a way to tell underdeveloped nations, we're staying out of your affairs. You see, going back all the way to the Monroe Doctrine, the United States held the right to protect Western ideals, Western as in Western Hemisphere, North and South America, Latin America especially, many of whom were fledgling republics that had declared independence from their former colonial oppressors, Spain, France, and England. Okay? So the United States wanted to reinforce those. And there was a Roosevelt corollary that basically said, hey, if any Europeans or otherwise come to colonize or imperialize or somehow manipulate Latin American countries, the United States is going to come to their defense. Oh boy. The Nixon Doctrine was essentially a de-escalation from that mindset. Hey, we'll support you if push comes to shove, but otherwise, you're kind of on your own. It's basically what Nixon was saying. And then, of course, Chile happened. Salvador Allende was a Marxist politician who comes to presidential power. And he tries to implement various different pricing controls and government takeover and land redistribution. Your typical Marxist and communist ideas he put into practice. Things were good for a year or two. And then all of a sudden, inflation starts to skyrocket in Chile and it promotes unrest. Okay? There are all kinds of different things. And then, of course, there are people who oppose Salvador Allende. Salvador Allende did not win a majority in the 1970 Chilean presidential election. There were several candidates. He was just the one who had the most. He had a lot of opposition. The United States, under Nixon, with the advisement of Henry Kissinger, supported many of Allende's fiercest rivals. They most notably supported General Augusto Pinochet, a Chilean army general who would, with U.S. backing, establish a coup d'etat. They would overthrow the Allende administration and they would kill Salvador Allende. And Augusto Pinochet would be the de facto dictator of Chile for a number of years thereafter. And he had a brutal regime. So the United States was involved in ending one foul by implementing another foul. Okay. Otherwise, though, the strife that we've seen in the Middle East, that's nothing new. See, in 1948, the United Nations established the old Jewish Holy Lands in current day Palestine to establish the nation state of Israel, especially given light of what happened in the Holocaust. Well, as you would expect, many Arab Palestinians who had moved into the region were quite unhappy about that. These people had vacated their holy land and now they were to be brought back and move us out. That causes a lot of tension. Okay, and many of the nations around Israel hold severe contempt for Israel. Jordan, Syria, Egypt, Lebanon, they hold severe contempt for Israel. And in 1967, many of these different countries attacked Israel and were largely beaten back within a matter of days. And Israel rather, as part of their spoils taking things back, actually increased their territory. They took more territory in the West Bank, in modern-day Jordan and Palestine. Okay? And they have laid claim to a substantial amount of new territory since then. Well, in 1973, on Yom Kippur, which is a high Jewish holiday, Egypt and Syrian forces directly attack Israel and kind of catch them by surprise. For the better part of 2 weeks, the Israelis collected themselves and eventually fought it back and made headway against. And they launched counteroffensives in the Sinai Peninsula against Egyptian forces and largely defeated the Egyptians. The Israelis don't mess around, man. They got a lot going there. Okay? Eventually, the Yom Kippur War, Israel would successfully defend itself. But major Arab powers around the Middle East really did not like Israel. They further did not like that the United States supported Israel. We were their allies. OPEC, which is the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Committee, OPEC, or companies rather, OPEC, largely controls Middle Eastern oil production. Well, many of these Arab countries, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Syria, Kuwait, Iraq, and other places around the Middle East that have large oil reserves, they're all a part of OPEC. Well, in the early 1970s, the majority of OPEC countries were those who directly opposed Israel and did not care to recognize their right to exist. So, in retaliation, OPEC began a painful trade embargo. They withheld petroleum from international destinations, including the United States. Well, what is petroleum? That's oil. What do you need to put in your cars to drive you around? You need gasoline. Guess what? When you send oil through a refinery, you clean it and burn it at a certain temperature, the output is gasoline. You need oil in your cars to drive. So when you don't have oil, you're not going to be able to drive. So OPEC creating an embargo creates an oil and gas shortage in the United States. If you think lines are long going into various different stores waiting to go to try and get toilet paper or anything like that in this whole coronavirus pandemic, you should have seen what things were like in 1973 and early 74 with the oil embargo. You might have to wait in a mile-long line to try and maybe get a little bit of gas at a gas station, and only to have it rationed, and you only get some of it. It kind of reminds me a little bit of what happened after Hurricane Harvey in August and September of 2017, when many of the Houston area refineries were severely hit and oil wasn't getting to various different parts of the country. Um, for the better part of 2 weeks there was kind of a gas panic. Were people going to be able to get gas at their local gas station? Because a lot of people did without. Okay, that was nothing compared to the oil embargo. It drove the price of oil sky high, and there wasn't any gas anywhere. You had to ration gas, and it just proved to Congress that we need to do something about our dependence on foreign oil. Further, we need to do something to improve gasoline and efficiency standards. If you ever wondered why the old speed limit on highways was 55 miles per hour, it was because it was deemed that a car's maximum efficiency is at 55 miles an hour and not at 75 that you see today. That was largely in response to the oil embargo in 73 and 74. And that's where Congress also enacted the idea that you need to improve standard miles per gallon. Okay. Otherwise, though, those were some things going on in the post-Vietnam era, also within the Nixon and Kissinger uh, power struggle, if you will.